It's an interesting thought experiment. What is the biggest scientific question we can possibly answer? Some people might say about like what happened before the Big Bang, like some big physics questions about the universe. I can see the argument for, how many alien civilizations or if there's other life out there. You want to speak to that a little bit? Like why is it the biggest question in your, why is it number one in your top 5 or?
I've evolved in this, right? I started off as a theoretical physicist. I went into computational astrophysics and magnetohydrodynamics of star formation. But I always, I was a philosophy minor. I always had these sort of bigger questions sort of floating around the back of my mind. And what I've come to now is the most important question for physics is what is life? What the hell is the difference between a rock and a cell, fundamentally? And what I really mean by this, and this is where I'm going to go non-traditional, is that really the fundamental question that is agency. What does it mean to be an autonomous agent? How the hell does that happen? I'm not a reductionist. I'm not somebody who's just like, well, you just put together enough chemicals and bing, bang, boom, and, it suddenly appears. There's something that really is going to demand a reconception of what nature itself is. Mm-hmm. And so, black holes are super cool. Cosmology is super cool. But really this question of what is life, especially by viewing it from the inside, because it's really about the verb to be, right? Really, what is the most impressing philosophical question beyond science is the verb to be. What is being, right? This is what Stephen Hawking said when he talked about what puts the fire in the equations. The fire, right? The fire is this presence. And this is where it touches things like, whatever you want to say, the sacred, spirituality, however you want to talk about. My first book was about science and human spirituality. So it's like, so this question of life, what makes life as a physical system, so different is to me much more, because it's, that's where being appears. Being doesn't appear out there, right? The only place it ever appears to any of us is us. Mm-hmm. So, I can do this kind of projection into this third person thing, but nobody ever has that God's eye view. That's a story we tell. This is where, this between us is where the verb to be appears.
So this is something that you write about in The Blind Spot, why science cannot ignore human experience, sort of trying to pull the fire into the process of science. And it's a kind of critique of materialism. Can you explain the main thesis of this book?
Yeah, so the idea of the blind spot is that there is this thing that is central to science. So we're using the blind spot as a metaphor, right? So the eye has an optic nerve, and the optic nerve is what allows vision to happen. So you can't have vision without the optic nerve, but actually you're blind to the optic nerve. There's a little hole in your vision where the optic nerve is. And what we're saying is that science has something like this. There is something that without which science would not be possible, but that science, the way it's been configured. And actually, when we mean the blind spot, I'll get into exactly what I mean, what it is, but it's not really science. It is a set of ideas that got glued onto science. It's a metaphysics that got glued onto science. And so what is that thing what is the blind spot? It's experience. It is presence. And by experience, people have to be very careful, because I'm not talking about being an observer. It's there's lots of words for it. There's direct experience. There is presence, being, the life world within the philosophy called phenomenology. There's the life world. It's this sort of raw presence that you can't get away from until you die. And then who the hell knows, as long as you're around, it's there. And what we're saying is that is the way to say this, that is the precondition for the possibility of science. And the whole nature of science, the way it has evolved, is that it purposely pushed that out. It pushed that out so it could make progress. And that's fine for a certain class of problems. But when we try and go deeper, there's a whole other class of problems, the nature of consciousness, the nature of time, quantum mechanics, that comes back to bite us. And that if we don't learn how to understand that is always the background, that experience is always the background, then we just end up with these paradoxes and these yoga that require this intellectual yoga to get out of.
I think you give a bunch of examples of that, like looking at temperature as a number. There's a very sort of objective scientific way of looking at that. And then there's the experience of the temperature.
And how you build the parable of temperature, that we call it. So what is the blind spot? We use the term, it's a constellation. It's not just materialism. It's a constellation of ideas that are all really sort of philosophical views. They're not what science says, but because of the evolution of the history of science and culture, they got like pin the tail on the donkey. They were sort of pinned on and to tell us that this is what science says. So what is it? One is reductionism, that you are nothing but your nerve cells, which are nothing but the chemistry, which is nothing but, all the way down to quarks. That's it. So that's reductionism. The objective frame, that science gives us this God's eye view, this third person view of the world, to view the world from the outside. That's what science, bequeaths to us, that view. Physicalism, that everything in the world is basically made of stuff. There's nothing else to talk about, right? That's all there is, and everything can be reduced to that. And then also the reification of mathematics, that mathematics is somehow more real than this. And there's a bunch of other things, but all of these together, what they all do is they end up pushing experience out and saying experience is an epiphenomena, consciousness. I tend not to use the word consciousness because I think it leads us in the wrong direction. We should focus on experience because it's a verb kind of in a way, or it's verb-like. So yeah, and by being blind to that, we end up with these paradoxes and problems that really not only block science, but also have been detrimental to society as a whole, especially where we're at right now.
So you actually say that from a perspective of detrimental society, that there's a crisis of meaning, and that we respond to that in a way that's counterproductive to these bigger questions, scientific questions. So the three responses you mentioned is scientific triumphalism, and then on the other side is rejecting science completely, both on the left and the right. I think the postmodernists on the left and the anti-establishment people on the right, and then just pseudoscience that kind of does this in-between thing. Can you just speak to those responses and to the crisis of meaning?
Right. So the crisis of meaning is that, on the one hand, science wants to tell us that we're insignificant, we're not important, we're just, biological machines. So we're basically an insignificant part of the universe. On the other hand, we also find ourselves being completely significant. In cosmology, we have to figure out how to look from the inside at cosmology. We're always the observers. We're at the center of this, collapsing wavefront of light. Quantum mechanics, it really comes in. It comes in, the measurement problem just puts us front and center. We've spent some people have spent 100 years trying to ignore the measurement part of the measurement problem. So on the one hand, we're insignificant, and on the other hand, we're central. So which one is it, right? And so this all comes from not understanding actually the foundational role of experience. This inability, we can't do science without already being present in the world. We can't reduce what happens in science to some sort of formal. A lot of it is about we love our formal systems, our mathematics, and we're substituting. That's one of the things that there's two philosophers we really like who are heroes. One is Husserl, who is a mathematician who invented phenomenology, and the other is Whitehead, who was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. And Husserl came up with this idea of the surreptitious substitution. Part of the blind spot is substituting a formal system, a calculus of data for actual experience. That's more important than. And so let me just do, before I go to those three responses, let's just do the parable of temperature, because I think it'll help them understand what we mean. So think about degrees Celsius, right? We kind of have in the modern scientific culture we live in, we think like, oh yeah, degrees Celsius, they're out there. The universe, it's, the molecular cloud in space is 10 degrees, Kelvin. The way we got there is we've forgotten how that idea is rooted in experience, right? We started off with science we had the subjective experience of hot and cold. I feel hot, I feel cold, you feel hot, you feel cold. Science was this process of trying to extract from those experiences what Michel Bitbol, a philosopher, calls the structural invariants, the things that we could both kind of agree on. So, we figured out we could make a gradiated little cylinder that's got mercury in it, and that, hot things will be higher in that, on that gradiated cylinder, cold things will be lower. And we can both kind of figure out what we're going to agree on are our standards for that. And then we have thermometry. Yay. We have a way of sort of having a structural invariant of this sort of very personal experience of hot or cold. And then from that, we can come up with thermodynamics, et cetera. And then we end up at the bottom of, at the end of that, with this idea of every day I wake up and I check my phone and I'm like, oh, it's going to be, 60 degrees out. Great. And we start thinking that 60 degrees is more real than hot and cold. That thermodynamics, the whole formal structure of thermodynamics is more real than the basic experience of hot and cold that it came from. It required that bodily experience that also, not just me, you, I have to tell, it's part of my communication with you. Cold today, isn't it? Right. That from that basic irreducible experience of being in the world, with everything that it involves, I developed degrees Celsius, but then I forgot about it. I forgot the experience. So that's called the amnesia of experience. So that's what we mean by how the blind spot emerges, how science purposely pushes experience out of the way so it can make progress. But then it forgets that experience was important. So where does this show up? Why is this, what are the responses to trying to get this back in, and where does this crisis of meaning emerge? So scientific triumphalism is the idea that the only thing that's true for us are scientific truths, right? Unless it can be codified in a formal system and represented as data, captured in some kind of scientific causal network, it doesn't even exist, right? And anything else that's not part of it, that can be formalized in that way, is an epiphenomenon. It's not real. So, scientific triumphalism is this response to the mystery, the weirdness of, I could call it the mystery, the weirdness of experience, by kind of just ignoring it completely. So there's no other truth, art, music, human spirituality, it's all actually reducible just to neural correlates. So that's one way that it's been dealt with. The other way is this sort of, you've got on the postmodern, the left, academic left, you get this thing like science is just a game. It's just a game from the powerful come up with, which is also not true. Science is totally potent and requires an account for what is happening. So that's another way to push sort of science away, or respond to it. The science denial that happens, that's also another way of sort of, not understanding the balance that science is that we need to establish with experience. And then there's just pseudoscience, which wants to sort of say like, the New Age movement or whatever, which wants to have, wants to deal with experience by kind of elevating it in this weird pseudo-spiritual way, or, that doesn't have the rigor of science. So all of these ways, all of these responses, we have this difficulty about experience. We need to understand how experience fits into the web of meaning. And we don't really have we don't have a good way of doing it yet. And the point of the book was to identify very clearly how the problem manifests, what the problem is, and what its effects are in the various sciences.
And by the way, we should mention that at least the first two responses, they kind of feed each other. There's just to observe the scientific community, those who sort of gravitate a little bit towards the scientific triumphalism, there's an arrogance that builds in the human soul. It has to do with PhDs, it has to do with sitting on an academic throne, all of those things, and the human nature with the egos and so on, it builds. And of course, that nobody likes arrogance, and so those that reject science, the arrogance is fuel for the people that reject science.
I absolutely agree.
It just goes back and it just is this divide that builds.
Yeah, no, and that was a problem. Like when you saw, so like I said, my first book was about science and human spirituality. So I was trying to say that, science is actually, if we look at what happens in human spirituality, not religion. Religion's about politics, right? But about, for the entire history of the species, we've had this experience of, for lack of a better word, the sacredness. I'm not connecting this God or anything. I'm just saying this experience of like the more. And then, with the new atheist movement, you got people saying that like anybody who feels that is an idiot. They just can't handle the hardcore science. When in fact, their views of the world are so denuded they can't even see the role that experience plays and how they came up with their formal systems, and experience fundamentally is weird, mysterious. It's like, it's kind of goes down forever in some sense. There is always more. So yeah, that arrogance then, just if you're telling everybody who's not hardcore enough to do the, standard model of cosmology that they're idiots, that's not going to bode well for your, the advance of your project.
So you're proposing at least to consider the idea that experience is fundamental. Experience is not just an illusion that emerges from the set of quirks, that there could be something about the conscious experience of the world that is like at the core of reality.
Yeah, but I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't, because there's panpsychism, right? Which wants
Right.
to
So
say
that's
that
all the way there. So
Yeah.
panpsychism is like, that's literally one of the laws of physics.
Right.
Is
But see, what
consciousness.
all those do is like just the idea of, say, like physicalism versus idealism, which are kind of the two philosophical schools you can go with. Physicalism says all that exists is physical. Idealism says all that exists is mind. We're actually saying, look, both of these, to take either of those positions is already to project out into that third person view, right? And that third person view, we want to really emphasize, is a fiction. It's a useful fiction when you're doing science, right? If I want to do like, the Newtonian physics of billiard balls on a pool table, great. I don't want to have to think about experience at all, right? But, if I'm asking deeper questions, I can't ignore the fact that there really is no third person view, and that any story I tell about the world is coming from, it's not just first person, but it's literally, because I'm going to argue that experience always involves all of us. Experience always originates out of a community. That, you're always telling those stories from the perspective of already existing, of already being in experience. So whatever account we want to give of the world is going to have to take that as experience as being irreducible and the irreducible starting point. So ultimately, like, we don't have an answer. Like, that's when people are like, well, what are you suggesting is the alternative? It's like, look, that's the good work of the next science to come. Well, our job was to point out the problem with this. But what we would argue with is, and we're thinking about the next book, is this is really going to require a new conception of nature, right? That doesn't sort of jump right to that third person, that fictional third person view, and somehow figures out how to do science, recognizing that it always starts from experience. It always starts from this field of experience, or in phenomenology, the word is the life world, that you're embedded in. You can't unembed yourself from it. So how do you do... So one of the things that Whitehead said was, we have to avoid the bifurcation of nature. And what he meant by that is the bifurcation into like sort of scientific concepts, wavelength. Think about like seeing a sunset. You can say like, oh, look, it's just wavelengths, and scattering particles. And your experience of the redness, the actual experience of the redness, and all the other things, it's not just red. There's no qualia. There's no pure redness. Everything that's happening in the experiential part is just an epiphenomena. It's just, brain states, whatever. He said you can't do that. They're both real. They're both accounts. They both need to be integrated. And so that required, I think, a different conception of what we mean by nature.
Is it something like incorporating in the physics, in the study of nature, the observer, the experiencing observer, or is that still also looking from a third person?
I think that's what we have to figure out, right? And so actually, a great place to think about this is quantum mechanics, right? Because one of the things we're arguing is like, look, in the chapter that I wrote on, because I wrote this with Evan Thompson, who's a wonderful philosopher, and Marcelo Gleiser, who's a theoretical physicist. When I was writing the chapter on the origin of the blind spot, like, sort of how this emerged out of history, the subheader was like, well, it made sense at the time, because it did. There was a reason why people adopted this third person, God's eye, deterministic view. This view of sort of like, the perfect clockwork of the universe, totally made sense. But by the time you got to the beginning of the 20th century, science itself was telling you like, And no place does this appear more than in quantum mechanics, right? Quantum mechanics slams you with the idea that of the measurement problem, The most important thing about quantum mechanics is you have a dynamical equation, the Schrodinger equation, which, you put in, like we talked about before, you have initial conditions, and now you got a differential equation, and you crank out the differential equation, and it makes predictions for the future, right? Exactly like Newtonian physics or its higher versions of the Lagrange or Hamiltonians. But then this other thing happens where it's like, oh, by the way, as soon as you look at it, as soon as the measurement is made, I have a whole nother set of rules for you. That's what we call the Born rule. And that was telling you right from the beginning that measurement matters, right? So when you're asking like, how will we do this? Quantum mechanics is actually pointing to how to do it. So, there's been all these different interpretations of the quantum mechanics. Many of them try to pretend the measurement problem isn't there, go to enormous lengths, like the many worlds interpretation, literally inventing an infinite number of unobservable parallel universes to avoid the thing that quantum mechanics is telling them, which is that measurements matter. And then you get something like Qbism, which is I'm going to advocate for, is a new interpretation of quantum mechanics, which puts the Born rule at the center, right? Instead of like focusing on the Schrodinger equation and the weird things that come out of it, like Schrodinger's cat and all that other stuff. It says, no, actually the real mystery is the Born rule. Let's think about the Born rule. And like you said, that puts the agent and information at the center of the whole thing.
So that's not a thing you're trying to get rid of. That's the thing you're trying to integrate at the center of the thing. In quantum mechanics, it becomes super obvious, but maybe this same kind of thing should be incorporated in every layer of study of nature.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. So, one of the things that's really interesting to me, so I have a project, I'm part of a big project that Chris Fuchs and Jacques Pannier on Qbism. So I've been part of that. And what I've been amazed by is the language they use. So what's cool about Qbism is it comes from quantum information theory. It's a pretty modern version of thinking about quantum mechanics. And it's always about, you have an agent who makes an action on the world, and then the information they get from that action through the experiment, that's the action on the world, updates their priors, updates their Bayesian. That's why it's called Qbism, quantum Bayesianism. Updates how the information they've gotten from the world. Now, this turns out to be it's kind of the same language that we're using in a project that's about the physics of life, where we have a grant from the Templeton Foundation to look at semantic information and the role of semantic information in living systems like cells. So, we have Shannon information, which is a probability distribution that tells you, basically how much surprise there is in a message. Semantic information focuses on meaning, right? Focuses on, and in a very simple way, just like how much of the information that the agent, the critter, is getting from the world actually helps it survive, right? That's the most basic idea of meaning, right? We can get all philosophical about meaning, but this is it. Does it help me stay alive or not? And the whole question of agency and autonomy that occurs in this setting of just asking about how do cells move up a chemical gradient to get more food kind of has the same feel, the same, sort of architecture as what's going on in quantum mechanics. So I think what you said is exactly it. How do we bring this sort of recognition that there's always us, the agent, or life, the agent, interacting with the world and drawing in, both giving information and passing information back as a way of doing science, doing hardcore science with experiments, but never forgetting that agency, which also means experience in some sense, is at the center of the whole thing.
So you think that could be something like Qbism, quantum Bayesianism, that creates a theory like a Nobel Prize winning theory, sort of like hardcore real theories that put the agent at the center.
Yes, that's what we're looking for. I think that's the exciting part. And it's a move, the scientific triumphalist thing says, and you understand why people love this. Like, I have these equations and these equations represent, there's this Platonic ideal that they are, they exist eternally on their own. It's kind of quasi-religious, right? It's sort of like somehow these equations are you're reading the mind of God. But this other approach to me is just as exciting because what you're saying is there's us and the world. They're inseparable, right? It's always us and the world. And what we're now finding about is this kind of co-creation, this interaction, between the agent and the world, such that these powerful laws of physics that need an account, like in no way am I saying these laws aren't important. These laws are amazing, but they need an account, but not an account that strips, that turns the agent into just an epiphenomena, that it pushes the agent out and makes it seem as if the agent's not the most important part of the story.
So if you pull on this thread and say there's a whole discipline born of this, putting the agent as the primary thing in a theory, in a physics theory, like how is it possible it just like breaks the whole thing open? So there's this whole effort of, unifying general relativity and quantum mechanics, of like coming up with a theory of everything. What if these are like the tip of the iceberg? What if the agent thing is like really important?
So, listen, that would be like kind of my dream. I'm not going to be the one to do it because I'm not smart enough to do it. But, Marcelo and I have been sort of critical of where foundational physics has been for a while with string theory. I've spent my whole life listening to talks about string theory real soon, and it's gotten ever more disconnected from data, observations. There were people talking for a while that it's post-empirical. And I always wanted to write a paper or an article that was like physicists have been smoking their own stash, right? There's this way we've gotten used to, like, you have to out weird the other person. Like, my theory has 38 dimensions. My theory has 22 dimensions, but it's got, psychedelic squirrels in it. And so there's been a problem. There's a problem. Now, I don't need to tell you there's a crisis in physics or there's a crisis in cosmology. Other people have used that. That's been the headline on Scientific American stories. So there clearly another direction has to be found. And maybe it has nothing to do with this. But I suspect that because so many times the agent or the having to deal with the view from the inside or the role of agency, like when it comes to time, thinking that you can replace the block universe with the actual experience of time. Clocks don't tell time. We use clocks to tell time. So maybe that even like the fundamental nature of time can't be viewed from the outside, that there's a new physics theory that is going to come from, that comes from this agential, informational, computational view. I don't know, but that's kind of what I think it would be fertile ground to explore.
Yeah, like time is a really interesting one. This time is really important to us humans. What is time?
Yeah, that's right. What is time? So the way we have tended to view it is we've taken, this is what, when Husserl talks about the surreptitious substitution, we've taken Einstein's beautiful, powerful, formal system for viewing time, and we substituted that for the actual experience of time, right? So the block universe, where like next Tuesday is already written down, it's in the block universe, the four-dimensional universe, all events are already there. Which is very potent for making certain kinds of predictions within the sort of, the scientific framework. But, it is not lived time. And, this was pointed out to Einstein, and he eventually recognized it. Very famous meeting between Henri Bergson, who was the most famous philosopher of like the, early 20th century, and Einstein, where Einstein was giving a talk on relativity, and Bergson, whose whole thing was about time and was about duration, he wanted to separate the scientific image of time, the map of time, from the actual terrain, which he used the word duration. Like we humans, where duration for us is full. It's sort of, it's stretched out. It's got a little bit of the past, a little bit of the future, a little bit of the present. Music is the best example, right? You're hearing music, you're both already anticipating what's going to happen, and you're, remembering what's going on. There's a kind of phenomenal structure there, which is different from the representation of time that you have with the formal mathematics. And what, the way we would look at this is that the problem with the surreptitious substitution, the problem with the blind spot, is it says, oh, no, the formal system is time. But really, the only place time appears is with us, right? Where we're time, So having a theory that actually could start with us, and then stretch out into the universe rather than imposing this imaginary third-person view back on us, that's a route towards a different way of approaching the whole problem.
I just wonder, who is the observer? I mean, define what the agent is.
Right.
In any kind of frame is difficult.
Is difficult, right? And so but that's the good work of the science ahead of us, right? What happened with this idea of the structural invariance I was talking about? So, we start with experience, which is irreducible. There's no atoms of experience, right? It's a whole. And we go through the whole process, which is a communal process, by the way. There's a philosopher, Robert Crease, who talks about the workshop. That's starting in like the 1700s, 1600s. We developed this communal space to work in. Sometimes it was literally a physical space, a laboratory, where these ideas would be pulled apart, refined, argued over, and then validated, and we went to the next step. So this idea of pulling out from experience these thinner, abstract, structural invariants, the things that we could actually do science with. And it's kind of like, we call it an ascending spiral of abstraction, right? So the problem with the way we do things now is we take those abstractions, which came from experience, and then with something like, a computational model of consciousness or experience, we think we can put it back in. Like you literally pulled out these super thin things, these abstractions, neglecting experience because that's the only way to do science. And then you think somehow, I'm going to jam experience back in and have an explanation for experience.
So do you think it's possible to show that something like free will is quote unquote real if you integrate experience back into the physics model of the world?
What I would say is that free will is a given. And that's the thing about experience, right? So one of the things that Whitehead said, I really love this quote, he says, it's not the job of either science or philosophy to account for the concrete. It's the job to account for the abstract. The concrete, what's happening between us right now, is just given. It's presented to us every day. It's presented to me. If you want an explanation, fine, but the explanation actually doesn't add anything to it, right? So that free will, in some sense, is the nature of being an agent, right? To be an agent, agency and autonomy are sort of the two things that are, they're equivalent. And so in some sense, to be an agent is to be autonomous. And so then the question really to ask is, can you have an account for agency and autonomy that captures aspects of its arising in the world, or the way it and the world sort of co-arise. But the idea, the reason why we argue about free will often is because we already have this blind spot view that the world is deterministic because of our equations, which themselves, we treat the equations as if they're more real than experience, and the equations are a paler, they don't corral experience. They are a thinner, representation. As we like to say, don't confuse the map for the terrain. What's happening between us right now, in this, all the weirdness of it, that's the terrain. The map is what I can write down on equations and then in the workshop do experiments on. Super powerful, needs an account, but experience overflows that.
What if the experience is an illusion? Like, how do we know? What if the agency that we experience is an illusion?
An illusion looking from where? Right? Because that already requires to take that stance is you've already pushed yourself into that third person view, okay. Right? And so what we're saying is that third person view, which now you're going to say like, oh, I've got a whole other set of entities, of ontological entities, meaning, things that I think exist in God's living room in spite, that are independent of me and the community of living things I'm part of.
So you're pushing it elsewhere. Just like there's a stack of turtles, there's probably, if this experience, the human experience is an illusion, maybe there's an observer for whom it's not an illusion. So you always have to find an observer somewhere.
Yeah, right. And that's why, fundamentally the blind spot, especially the scientific triumphalist part is following a religious impulse. It's wanting the God's eye view. And what's really interesting, and when we think about this and the way this gets talked about, especially publicly, there's a line of philosophical inquiry that this language gets couched in. And it is actually it's only one version of philosophy, right? So it is pretty much what we call the analytic tradition, right? But there's even in Europe, or in the Western tradition, in the for Western, what we'll call Western philosophy, there's phenomenology. There's Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, which took an entirely different track. They were really interested in the structure of experience. They spent all their time trying to understand, trying to develop a language that could kind of climb into the circle that is experience, right? Experience, you're not gonna be able to start with axioms and work your way to it. It's given, so you have to kind of jump in and then try and find a language to account for its structure. But then, so that has not been part of this discussion about, good luck finding a YouTube video where someone, a famous scientist is talking about science from a phenomenological point of view, even though it's a huge branch of philosophy. And then you get the philosophies that occurred from other cores of civilization, right? So there's the Western core, out of which comes the Greeks and the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But then you get India and you get Asia, and they developed their own. They were highly complex societies that developed their own responses to these questions. And they, for reasons, because they had contemplative practice, they were very focused on trying to directly probe attention and experience. They asked questions in ways that the West never really did. Phenomenology kind of started it, but there's philosophers like Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu, and they're like the Plato and the Aristotle of sort of those philosophies, and they were really focused on experience. In the West, I think maybe because we had the Judeo-Christian tradition, where we already had this kind of God who was going to be the frame on which you could always point to that frame. The traditions that came from the classical philosophies of India and Asia, they started always with they wanted to know about experience. Their whole philosophies and their logic and their argumentation was based on, I've got this experience. I can't get out of this experience. How do I reason from it? So I think there's like a lot of other philosophical traditions that we could draw from, not like slavishly. We don't all have to become Buddhists to do it, but there are traditions that really tried to work this out in a way that the Western traditions just didn't.
But there's also the practical fact that it's difficult to build a logical system on top of experience. It's difficult to have the rigor of science on top of experience. And so as science advances, we might get better and better. Like the same as it's very difficult to have any kind of mathematical or kind of scientific rigor to why complexity emerges from simple rules and simple objects, sort of the Santa Fe questions.
Yeah, I think we can do it. I think there's aspects of it. I mean, as long as you're never trying to like, this is what experience is. Like, I think that's kind of the where we're, you're never going to have a causal account of experience because it's just given. But you can do lots about, and that's what the good work is to, how do I approach this? How do I approach this in a way that's rigorous that I can do experiments with also? But so, for example, I was just reading this beautiful paper that was talking about in the, this is what we're counting with our semantic information too, causal closure. Love this idea, right? The idea that, so we talked about autopoiesis a while back, right? The idea that living systems are, they are self-creating and self-maintaining. So the membrane, cell membrane is a great example of this, right? The cell membrane, you can't have a cell without a cell membrane. The cell membrane lets stuff through, keeps other stuff out, right? But the cell membrane is part of the processes and it's a product of the processes that the cell membrane needs, right? In some sense, the cell membrane creates itself. So there's this strange, it's always with life, there's always this strange loop.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow figuring out how to jump into that strange loop is, the science that's ahead of us. And so this idea of causal closure, accounting for how we talk about like downward causation, right? So reductionism says everything only depends on the microstate. Everything just depends on the atoms, right? That's it. You don't really, if you know the Lagrangian for the standard model, you're done. Of course, in principle, you need God's computer, but fine. In principle, it can be done. Causal closure, and I was just reading this great paper that sort of argues for this. There's ways in which using epsilon machines and all this machinery from information theory, that you can see ways in which the system can organize itself so that it decouples from the microstates. Now, the macrostate fundamentally no longer needs the microstate for its own description, its own account of the laws. Whether that paper is true or not, it's an example of heading down that road. There's also Robert Rosen's work. He was a theoretical biologist who he talked about closure to efficient cause, that living systems, are organizationally closed, are causally closed, so that they don't depend anymore on the microstate. And he had a proof, which is very contentious. Nobody knows if it's, some argue it's true, some argue it's not. But he said that because of this, living systems are not church Turing complete. They cannot be represented as formal systems. So, in that way, they're not axioms. Living systems will not be axioms. They can only be partially captured by algorithms. Now, again, people fight back and forth about whether or not his proof was, is valid or not. But I'm saying, I'm giving you examples of like, when you see the blind spot, when you acknowledge the blind spot, it opens up a whole other class of kinds of scientific investigations. The book we thought was going to be really heretical, right? Obviously, most public facing scientists are very sort of in that, especially scientific triumphalism. So we were just like waiting for the fight. And then the review from Science came out and it was like totally pro, they was very positive. We're like, oh my God, Yeah. And then a review came out in Nature Physics and it was totally positive. And then a review came out in the Wall Street Journal because we kind of criticized, not capitalism, but we criticized sort of all industrial economies for that they were sort of had been touched by the blind spot. Mm-hmm. Socialism, communism, doesn't matter. These extractive, had sort of had that sort of view that the world is just reducible to, resources. The Wall Street Journal gave us a great review. So it feels like there's actually out there is some, among working scientists in particular, there is some dissatisfaction with this triumphalist view and a recognition that we need to shift something in order to like jump past these hurdles that we've been arguing about forever. And we're not, we're sort of stuck in a vortex.
Well, it is. I mean, I think there is a hunger to acknowledge that there's an elephant in the room, like that we're just removing the aging. Like it's, everyone is doing it. And it's like, yeah. There's the experience, and then there's the third person perspective on the world.
Right.
And so science from applying scientific rigor from a first person perspective is very difficult. I mean, it's fascinating.
I think we can do it because it's also the thing, what's really interesting is I think it's not just first person, it's first and second, right? Because science, one idea is that the idea that, science gives us this objective third person view. That's one way of talking about objectivity. There's a whole other way, is that I do the experiment, you do the experiment, we talk to each other, we agree on methods, and we both get the same result. That is a very different way of thinking about objectivity. And it acknowledges that, when we talk about agents, agency and individuality are flexible, right? So there's a great paper, speaking of Santa Fe, by David Krakauer, where they looked at sort of information theoretic measures of individuality. And what you find is it's actually pretty fluid. Like, my liver cell is an individual, but really it's part of the liver. And my liver is, a separate system, but really it's part of me. But I'm an individual, yay. But actually I'm part of a society. And I couldn't be me without the entire community of, say, language users, right? I wouldn't even be able to frame any questions. And my community of language users is part of ecosystems, right? That are alive, that I am a part of a lineage of. This is like Sarah Walker stuff. And then those ecosystems are part of the biosphere, right? We're never separable, as opposed to this very atomizing, the triumphalist science view wants like Boltzmann brains. You're just a brain floating in the space,
Yeah, there's a fascinating degree to which agency is fluid. Like, you are an individual, but you and I talking is a kind of individual.
Yeah.
And then the person listening to this right now is also an individual.
Right.
I mean, that's a weird thing too.
That's a weird thing, right?
Because there's a broadcast nature too.
Yeah. This is why information theoretic. So the idea that we're pursuing now, which I get really excited about, is this idea of information architecture, right? Or organization, informational organization. Because, right, physicalism is like everything's atoms. But, Kant is apparently the one who came up with the word organism, because he recognized that life has a weird organization that was specifically different from machines. And so this idea that, how do we engage with the idea that organization, which is often, I can be cast in information theoretic terms, or computational terms even, is sort of, it's not really quite physical, right? It's embodied in physical, in the physical, it has to instantiate in the physical, but it also has this other realm of design, and some, not design like intelligent design, but there's a, organization itself is a relationship of constraints and information flow. And I think, again, that's an entirely new, interesting way that we might get a very different kind of science that would flow out of that.
So going back to Kant and organism versus machine. So I showed you a couple of legged robots.
Very cool.
Is it possible for machines to have agency?
I would not discount that possibility. I think there's no reason I would say that it's impossible that machines could, whatever it manifests, that strange loop that we're talking about, that autopoiesis. I don't think there's a reason to say it can't happen in silicon. I think whatever it would be very different from us. Like the idea that it would be like, it would be just like us, but now it's instantiated. And I think it might have very different kind of experiential nature. I don't think what we have now, like the LLMs, are really there. I'm not going to say that it's not possible.
I wonder how far you can get with imitation, which is essentially what LLMs are doing. So imitating humans. And I wouldn't discount either the possibility that through imitation you can achieve what you would call consciousness or agency or the ability to have experience. I think for most of us humans to think, that's just fake, that's copying. But there's some degree to which we humans are just copying each other. We just are really good imitation machines. Yeah. Coming from babies, we were born in this world and we're just learning to imitate each other. And through the imitation and the tension in the disagreements in the imitations, we gain personality, perspective, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think so. It's possible, right? It's possible. But I think probably the view I'm advocating would say that one of the most important parts of agency is there's something called E4, the E4 theory of cognition: embodiment, inaction, embedding, and there's another one, extension. But so the idea is that you actually have to be in a body, which is itself part of an environment that is the physical nature of it, and of the extension in with other living systems as well is essential. So that's why I think the LLMs are not going to, it's not just imitation. It's going to require, this goes to the brain in the vat thing. I did an article about the brain in the vat, which was really Evans. I was reporting on Evans, where they did the brain in the vat argument, but they said, look, in the end, actually, the only way to actually get a real brain in the vat is actually to have a brain in a body. And if it could be a robot body, but you still need a brain in the body. So I don't think LLMs will get there because they can't, you really need to be embedded in a world. At least that's the E4 idea.
The E4, the 4E approach to cognition argues that cognition does not occur solely in the head, but is also embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended by way of extracranial processes and structures. Though very much in vogue, 4E cognition has received relatively few critical evaluations. This is a paper. By reflecting on two recent collections, this article reviews the 4E paradigm with a view to assessing the strengths and weaknesses. That's fascinating. I mean, yeah, the branches of what is cognition extends far, and it could go real far.
Right. There's a great story about an interaction between Jonas Salk, who was very much a reductionist, the great biologist, and Gregory Bateson, who was a cyberneticist. And Bateson always loved to poke people. And he said to Salk, where's your mind? And, Salk went, up here. And Bateson said, no, out here. And what he really meant was this extended idea. It's not just within your cranium. To have experience, experience in some sense is not a thing you have. It is a thing you do, right? You almost perform it in a way, which is why both actually having a body, but having the body itself be in a world with other bodies is, from this perspective, is really important. And it's very attractive to me. And, seeing, again, if we're really going to do science with them, we're going to have to have these ideas crash up against data, we can't just armchair it, or couch quarterbacking it. But I think there's a lot of possibility here. It's a very radically different way of looking at what we mean by nature